Hi, everyone. So glad to be with you today in the Medina County Historical Commission. I am giving a presentation that I gave a version of a few months ago for the Castro Colonies Heritage Association with a few updates, but I'm excited to give it again. And since it's been a few months, I'm learning new things every day as I work on this dissertation, which I hopefully should be done within the year, and you'll be able to see that. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and start sharing my screen. We'll get our PowerPoint up there. Now, if you're watching this video, it means we had a shaky connection. So I apologize if there's anything that I'm about to repeat, but we're going to go ahead and start from the very beginning, just in case. So once I go ahead and share this. Now I know my video is blocking the upper corner here, but hopefully you can see me and it's not going to block anything that's important in the presentation. So most of you, I believe, know who I am. My name is Trish Markert. I'm a PhD candidate at Binghamton University, where I am working on my dissertation on the history and the archaeology and the oral history of the Castro Colonies, looking particularly at Castroville and Dehennis. So today's presentation is called Maps and Memories, the Old Dehennis Archaeological Mapping Project. And while I've done a lot of research all around Medina County, this particular presentation is going to focus on the work that me and my archaeological field crew did in Old Dehennis in the winter of 2018. It's hard to believe it's 2020, time just flies. It feels like I was there just a few days ago. So it's nice to meet anyone who hasn't met me yet, and hello to everyone that I know. I wish I could be with y'all in person, but this is what we're gonna do for today, and hopefully I'll be able to make it down there sometime soon. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the archaeological work that we did in Old Dehennis. This is part of the subject of my dissertation, and I'll do some historical background first so that we're all on the same page. As many of you know, since we've worked together on this for several years now, this project has many parts. So there's an oral history component, which I'm working hard on. I've looked at Castroville, Queehee, Vandenberg, and Newfoundland, Dehennis. I've scanned hundreds of photographs. I've looked at archival materials, which I'm actually very deeply in right now. I'm writing a chapter on my research in the archive, which I'm happy to chat a little bit more about. And today we're really, like I said, going to focus on the archaeology because there's a lot to share there. And I think that there's some really interesting things for everyone to see. And also I would love to hear some feedback from you on the work as it's in process. This is still a work in process. I'm mainly working on writing currently, but also different ways of sharing the research with everyone down in Texas. And I did get a bit of good news recently in that I got a fellowship for writing this year from the American Council of Learned Societies, which is a big deal. So I'm very grateful to them for the support. It means I can really just focus on this project for the full year. And I'm actually doing that from here in Eugene, Oregon, where my husband recently got a 2-year position at the University of Oregon. So we made a huge trek across the country, and we're now in the Pacific Northwest, and it's beautiful. We really are enjoying it so far. As you can see, it's getting a little bright over here, so we're gonna shift so you can continue to see me here. So to move along with this, I think everyone recognizes or may recognize the folks on the screen. This is my amazing archaeological field crew. From left to right, you see me, Hunter Crosby, Nolan O'Hara, and Emily Sains. They made this possible. Big thanks to them. They were the best field crew someone could ask for. And they're the ones who helped me do this work. So what we're talking about today, this was made absolutely possible. Most of it was done by this amazing crew, all of whom graduated from Binghamton University. You can see me here on the right working at one of the ruins that we recorded in Old Dehennis. This was part of the Rudinger complex. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But as you can see, I've got my hard hat on and I'm using different measuring tapes to actually make an elevation sketch of that wall. So let me talk a little bit about what I've been up to since I was last in Texas, which was actually August of 2019. And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, due to everything that's going on, I've had to cancel 2 trips down there. I really wanted to see everybody in April and then again in August, and actually in September as well for my CCHA talk. But for the time being, we need to connect remotely. So I'm really glad for this opportunity to be able to do that. But I've been busy with some other things as well. Here you can see I still am the lab director for the excavations that happened at the Beery R House, which is now the Living History Center, which is right next to where y'all are right now. And so I've been focusing on getting that assemblage completed. We have lots of materials. We're excited to be able to represent and show those in a museum exhibit for the Living History Center, hopefully soon. But my focus has really been on historic bottles, and we have an incredible bottle collection from this site. I mean, we can tell so much about what folks were doing, what they were using. Here you see everything from a perfect mason ball jar. People were really, keen on canning, preserving food in that way. You see lemon juice bottles, the green bottles here. You can see that some bottles are being produced in San Antonio on the bottom of this Coke bottle in the upper center. And then you have some really old bottles as well. So you can see in the bottom left, this is actually a wine or a liquor bottle, which dates to the 19th century. And you can tell because of a certain type of technology that was used to attach what we call the finish, the top of the bottle, to the rest of the bottle. It bleeds some glass there and is really distinctive. And these probably came from the types of celebrations that the German folks and Alsatian folks were doing as they were putting up their houses. So again, a little neat piece of history. I'm happy to talk more about this, but it's not the focus of the talk. I just wanted to update y'all on some of this, which we're hoping to have completed very soon as well. So to get into Old D'Hanis, the first time I came to D'Hanis, I actually didn't know that much about the town. I was working on the archaeological crew with Dr. Ruth Van Dyke, my advisor, at the Beery R House. And, some of the crew members and we drove out to D'Hanis, and one of the first impressions I had of Old D'Hanis was St. Dominic's. I think we're all familiar. It's a beautiful stone ruin of one of the earliest Catholic churches in this area, and the earliest Catholic church of D'Hanis, other than potentially a small wooden structure that did serve as the Catholic church before they were able to put up this larger one. And we can talk more about that later as well. But I was confronted by this really beautiful ruin, and I was really curious about the history of this particular town, Old Town, since it shared so much history with Castroville, since it was one of the original Castro colonies. So over the next year, it was clear here that there were a lot of stories, that it wasn't just the church. It's obviously the generations and the folks that have lived here for their lives and their ancestors before them. So over the next year, I met folks from all around D'Hanis. I attended 3 of the D'Hanis homecoming picnics. The first one I walked into, I didn't know anybody until I walked in, and the one person I had met was Dennis Burrell, and he was standing there in Holy Cross Church and proceeded to introduce me to just about everybody in town. So I got to know a lot of folks, and I started hearing the stories, and I started doing some research into how the old town of D'Hanis was organized. So we're going to talk a little bit about that going forward. But quickly, let's go to Castroville, because we know Castroville was the earlier of the towns, settled in 1844 by Henry Castro and 27 original colonists. And one of the things that I'd like to talk about here is how Castroville is organized, its town plan. So I believe it was laid out by John James, I want to say, though there's some records that attribute it to Charles de Montel, in some case Theodore Gentiles. But John James was really the surveyor who was doing a lot of this work for the Castro colonists from day one. And as you can see here, the plan of Castroville, an early plan here, and another plan, again, founded in 1844. I think this map comes a little later because you can see people's names written on the plots. But it's laid out on a grid. It's in the kind of a hook of the Medina River, a really good spot for a town. Early records talk about it as being incredibly fertile, as having really nice shade trees, in what is otherwise a pretty rough landscape of Texas. So this was a really good place for a town. And interestingly too, so we see it laid out on a grid, and we also see here the central square, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. Houston Square right there in front of St. Louis Catholic Church. And what's important to note here is that this particular layout would have actually been pretty familiar for the European migrants at the time. You have small town lots, your houses are organized close together, there's a central gathering place, it's organized around the Catholic Church, this was a heavily Catholic community. And then outside of the town, on the other side of the river in this case, you had 20-acre farming plots. So this was actually an innovation by Castro at the time. He brought people over to settle on larger plots, as we'll discuss, but when it became apparent that that was actually quite difficult to do given the terrain and some of the conflict happening in this area, he actually bought additional land and decided to organize it in this way, which was for protection, but also very familiar to the folks that were migrating at the time. I'm sure a lot of what I'm saying is not new news to everyone here, but again, it sort of lays a foundation for what we'll be looking at in Old D'Hanis. You can see here, this is actually a modern day Google Earth image of Castroville, and it has retained the same plan that you see in these very early maps. So other than Highway 90, modern Highway 90 coming through town and kind of cutting a broad swath through what was once a historic district, the plan has stayed mostly the same in Castroville. And we know that's not the case in D'Hanis, and I'll get to that in just a second. So as I mentioned, a lot of this has to do with how colonists are given land under their agreement with Henry Castro. So we know that Henry Castro was an impresario. It meant that he received large land grants from the Republic of Texas, which were later honored for a short period of time by the United States. And his goal was to settle European migrants from the Rhine region in particular, which is a contested region, as we know, between France and Germany. I won't go too deeply into this. Again, I think most people are familiar with this history. But in short, the whole idea is that migrants would receive land and some resources to make a new life. For every person or family Castro brought to Texas, he would receive an equivalent amount of land, usually out of their own land grant, right? We'll discuss that. So this was a business venture, and it worked out in various ways. We all know there was a very colorful history to this, and there's a lot more to get into here. But to talk about the plots, you can see an 1879 map of Medina County here. We know that Castro settled 4 colonies: Castroville, followed by Quihue, Vandenberg, and Newfoundland, and then finally D'Hanis in 1847. He had originally wanted to found a lot more than this, both here around his land grant and on another grant that he received along the Rio Grande. So interestingly, all of these towns, I think they border his land grant, but only, I believe, D'Hanis sits on it. And I could be wrong about that. There might be someone correcting me, so please do in the questions. But Castro actually had to buy a lot of additional land in order to make these colonies work in places where there was water. Though, of course, in Newfoundland, they needed to move from Vandenberg closer to a water source. And that type of thing. So there was a lot of working around some of the challenges of the time and of the land grant that he was provided, which was difficult to access in those early days. But like I said, what he does, and just to kind of give some numbers, the original grant allocated 320 acres for single men and 640 acres for families. And what Castro did when he signed contracts with the migrants was to divide that in half. So they would receive that grant, and then sort of as payment for him taking them over there and helping to settle the colony, they would grant him back half of that. So that meant that families were receiving 320 acres and single men were receiving about 160 acres. I think that came down to the honor system. In the end, there wasn't a good way for him to enforce that. And many colonists did give him back that half of land, and I think many didn't as well. Still, he did make out with quite a bit of land at the end of this endeavor. So to move on, as you know, we see this type of organization in Castroville, but we also see it in D'Hanis, in Old D'Hanis. Again, only a few years separate these colonies. The major difference is that D'Hanis is actually a lot more remote than Castroville. It's about 30 miles removed on what was considered to be the Texas frontier at the time. But we see this similar type of organization. This is a plat map from the 1840s of Old D'Hanis, and you can see there's actually family names. This is once people started claiming plots of land. The church, I don't know that you can see my cursor, but it's right in the center here. I wonder if I can annotate for you. Let's see, spotlight. And if I can highlight where the church is, which is right here. Oh, that's just not very good. But you can see the red line there. That's where the church is located, and then the town plots are around it. This here that you see the line, mouse, this here that you see is Parker Creek, which was the main source of water. It was a running creek at the time. It's since only, it's dried up and runs sort of seasonally. You have the church here, and then you can see these town lots, which were a ½ an acre each. Outside, you have 20-acre lots, which were farming land on the outside of the town. So again, we see this is similar in some ways to Castroville, but it's different as well. What I'm going to do is we'll get out of this and advance to the next slide. So this pops this out a little bit more so that you're able to see it. And I'm going to go back to my mouse. Hopefully you can see that. So again, here's the church, the different plots of land, the Parker Creek, and that all situates right in here. But it's obviously a little bit different from Castroville too. It's located close to water, but it's also sort of stretched out north and south. It doesn't have this central square that we see in Castroville. And I think that's likely because it was stretching between some different competing forces. So people wanted to be close to the water source, but you also have old Highway 90 coming across here, which is where most of your traffic is coming through town. So you see the town stretching up towards that thoroughfare as well. So this might have something to do with how it's laid out, but I think likely this long north-south kind of trajectory for the town plan likely has more to do with the north-south alignment of the Parker Creek. But this is one of the things I'd like to look at. This is something that several of you may have already seen as well. Let's get out of that. But what I did here is I actually took a Google Earth image and I overlaid that early plat map on top of it. Now I'm sure this is a little difficult to see in the Legion Hall. It requires some light, but you can see that actually these plots, they line up really well, really closely with the landscape as it is today. So when I started looking at Old D'Hanis, I wanted to see who was potentially settling on what plot of land, and for the ruins that we're looking at, who might have lived in those early homes. So this was a really valuable resource for that. And I hope to make several versions of this, one that's a little cleaner and easier to read as we go forward. So I'll have that to share at some point as well. Of course, other things affected the organization, the town plan of Old D'Hanis too. So moving on. First, you have the John James Addition, and this actually, it spreads the town further north of Highway 90, which you see coming through down here, and adds town plots and farming plots north of that. And we do have old homes stretching up north of D'Hanis, again, along the Parker Creek. So D'Hanis gets this kind of long layout. People are maybe a little bit more spread out than they are in Castroville, but they have access to their farming lots on the outside of town. And they still are relatively settled close together. So the John James Addition was one of these early kind of changes that we see, extensions that we see of Old D'Hanis. And of course, I'm sure many of you expect this, another major event or development that affected Old D'Hanis was the location of Fort Lincoln. So Old D'Hanis was struggling in a lot of ways as this remote frontier settlement, and the establishment of Fort Lincoln for the US Army on the Texas frontier was sort of a life-saving event for the town. A lot of folks kind of moved up northwest towards Fort Lincoln, established stores, worked for the fort in various capacities. And this was a bit of a lifeline for the town. So we see it stretching to the north and west too, sort of orienting itself to Fort Lincoln, which was there for a very short period of time, but sort of had a lasting influence on the organization of the town, and also the town's longevity, its ability to survive. This is a great map that I found of Fort Lincoln, and I'm sure some of you have seen it before, showing where some of the structures were located along the Saco Creek there. But of course, the biggest change came to Old D'Hanis when the railroad came through town. And I think many of us are familiar with this story as well. But around 1881, the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad is constructed through the area. And there's a lot of stories about this, about why it went 5 miles south of Castroville. I'm sure you've heard the stories, we don't have to get into those. But it came about 1.5 miles north and west of D'Hanis. And this was close enough that the residents could actually make a decision: do we stay in our original settlement, or do we sort of rebuild a town along the railroad where you have a lot more access to resources, to goods, to networks, that type of thing, to commerce. So this resulted in the splitting of D'Hanis. Some residents built new businesses, took advantage of the proximity of the railroad, and this resulted in the sort of street line that you see in D'Hanis today, which looks very much like an old railroad town, an American railroad town, with the storefronts, with a saloon, a bank, a general store. There was a dance hall, that type of thing, post office. And so you get a little downtown center happening around in New D'Hanis. And like I said, this is a classic American Main Street layout. It looks a little bit different than what we see in Castroville or in Old D'Hanis, because they're borrowing more from American ways of organizing the town now that a few decades have passed, and because they have access to brick in ways that they didn't when they originally settled the area of Old D'Hanis, because of the D'Hanis and the Saco brick factories. There's so much here that I can't touch on in the context. I think I'm already starting to go long because I could talk about this for ages. But this resulted in other changes as well. Holy Cross, a beautiful church out of brick, is built just south of the town. So this is a little different too. It's not at the center of the town like we see it in Castroville or maybe in Old D'Hanis, but it's still local and easy for residents to get to. It's still a very deeply Catholic community. And one of my favorite stories about the splitting of D'Hanis is the church picnic, which happens yearly. And for a while, the different factions: do we stick with St. Dominic's? Do we, move the congregation to Holy Cross? Held competing picnics. And the Old Town, sort of those that were proponents of Old Town, would try to get people coming into town for the picnic at an earlier spot along the railroad to get them to come to their celebration. But ultimately, Newtown did win out. And in the early 1900s, about 1914, the church was completed and St. Dominic's was abandoned. So these are big changes happening in a relatively short period of time, and it explains a little bit why we see these differences between New D'Hanis and Castroville, New D'Hanis and Old D'Hanis. People are kind of keeping up with the times and making new decisions based on the resources that are available to them. But there are some things that aren't clear. Oh, let me quickly just point out, this is a 1915 Medina County map. It's available at the Portal to Texas History. And what I like about this is that they have D'Hanis here labeled right by the William Templin lot. You can see it's laid out north-south like we're familiar with. But right here, they've added a circle that shows you where New D'Hanis is. So there are 2 D'Hanises on this map in 1915. And that's because Newtown is really just starting to come into its own. So you see D'Hanis labeled here with the circle, and then D'Hanis, Old D'Hanis labeled down here. And this line coming through here is, of course, at this time, the Southern Pacific Railroad. So again, we see these changes playing out on maps as well. Let's get out of that. So moving forward, I'm going to start talking about the actual archaeology that we were doing. I know it took me a while to get here, but hopefully it's been interesting so far. Oh, this here, of course, is a plat of New D'Hanis. You can see again, it's really oriented to the railroad. That's what's the center of town. That's where all of the business is coming in. It's sort of the lifeline for this particular town. And this was from 1887, so it was one of the really early, the original plat maps for New D'Hanis. So I'm going to get into Old D'Hanis because one of the things that I was curious about, we can see on the maps where the plats are, where the land was, but we don't see where the structures were. We don't really know what the homes looked like quite so much. We don't know how they were laid out in relation to each other. Whereas Castroville still has a lot of its old homes, and we can get a good sense of that in the landscape, in the town plan. So my goal was to go into Old D'Hanis and survey some of the ruins that are still standing and try to get a sense of what these homes looked like and where they were located. And here you have a reference map of historic properties in the Old D'Hanis Historic District, which was an amazing find by Lily Bolin, who has been a great partner in my research. I don't know if she's watching today, but when she found this map, sort of buried in the recesses of the internet, it was a National Register of Historic Places nomination for D'Hanis back in 1976, organized by Oliver Reinhardt and Josie Finger. We were outside a car and she showed it to me, and I think we jumped up and down. We were excited about this because it labels some of the old homes as Oliver and Josie remembered them, and also as they were standing and who they belonged to. So this was just an incredible piece of information that's available. If anybody wants me to send it to them, I certainly can. And for the most part, this does line up with what we see. There's a few kind of small inconsistencies, but it's just a great resource for Old D'Hanis. And in this next slide, I'm going to show you the houses that we're going to be talking about today, because these were the structures that were surveyed during the Old D'Hanis Archaeological Mapping Project. So we have the Joseph Nye House and the Stagecoach Inn along the Parker Creek, the Peter Cook House. We looked at the Rudinger Complex, which is a little further south, and then down south of the church, the Zurcher House. And so in total, we surveyed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ruins. And there's a couple that I'm not going to talk about today, but I'm going to focus on some of the highlights. So let's go ahead and get right into that. So the methods for recording structures. First, I have to say a big thank you. These are all on private property. They aren't accessible to the general public. I was incredibly lucky to work with property owners who were really welcoming. Polo Rodriguez, Estela Rodriguez Boone, both allowed us to come onto their property and look at some of these pieces of history and just made it absolutely possible. So a huge thank you to both of them. What we did once we got onto these sites was we cleared the ruins off. So most of them were under a lot of overgrowth. Again, I had an amazing crew who were able to get in there and cut a lot of that back so we could see what was going on. Braving the elements. We never saw a snake. We had that freeze in 2018, you might remember it, and I think it was in our favor. We would map them. So you can see here, this is a setup for me drawing an elevation map of this particular wall in the Rudinger complex with a rather elaborate fireplace. I took GPS points with a portable GPS unit called a Trimble. Many, many photographs of the artifacts that we saw on the surface, architectural details of the structures. And then I used those thousands of photographs to actually build 3D models of the ruins that we looked at. So I'm going to take you through some of these structures and show you what we found. Oh, one more thing. This was a serendipitous sort of occurrence. As it turned out, right after we did all this work, all of this clearing work, Google Earth uploaded new satellite imagery in December of 2018. So if you go on Google Earth, you can actually see the ruins from the satellite much more clearly than you would be able to otherwise, because it captured it right after we cleared them. And so this is just, I mean, it's lucky for me because I have really great imagery, and it's lucky for everyone else because I think it preserves that bird's eye view in a way that we weren't able to as archaeologists ourselves. And I'm happy to talk to people about how to find this on Google Earth if you're interested. So getting into the structures. Structure 1 is what we called the Nye Stagecoach Shop. This was founded by Johann Nye, and it was built in the 1850s in a way that we're familiar with from seeing these other early structures out of limestone blocks or sandstone blocks, sort of a rubble construction. This is actually a photograph taken in the 1970s for the Historic American Building Survey when it came through and documented some of the places in Old Dehennis. So in the 19th century, this served as a stagecoach inn. It served as a small general store and Joseph Nye's residence. And you can see it's probably gone through some changes between then and the 1970s. In the 20th century, it was the home of Nicolas Rodriguez, and you know, several members of his family grew up here as well. And then unfortunately, it did burn down in the 1980s due to a fire. On a night that was so cold, the fire engines could not get water flowing through their hoses. So a big loss there. But today, to look at it, it is a ruin, but it's in remarkably good condition. And you can just see so much of the architectural element from what's going on, how we were able to survey it today. So this here that you see right next to the HAB survey photograph is a 3D model of the current structure. So by taking thousands of photographs, I was able to create a 3-dimensional model of it. And if we were doing this live, I would try to pull up my screen and show you what this model looks like in the software, but I think that our connection might be a little shaky for that. So hopefully soon I'll be able to do that online in a way that you're able to access yourself. This is a big structure, actually. I forget the exact dimensions of it, but it's about the size of 2 small houses with a dog trot in the center. I'm gonna get my mouse back here so that you can see. So this is a picture of that 3D recreation that I did on my computer. It's a little messy. This is a sparse point cloud. So I layer it with more photographs. We get more dots later on to make a more realistic looking image. But here you can see sort of a bird's eye view. This is one side of the house. This over here would have been the front. You would have had the sloping roof coming back this way, and it had a dog trot, and stagecoaches were able to come right through here. And there was also a pen for horses, outbuildings, that type of thing. These 2 pieces were built together, and then this was added on as a store later on. So photogrammetry allows us to kind of look at it with this bird's eye view and explore the structure even if we're not there on the ground with it. One of the really interesting things about this, so you can see the dog trot here. We cleared it out really nicely. This was a wide open space going through the 2 original sections of the building. But one of the neat things, oh, and one thing before I get to that, the sandstone turns red in high heat. And so you can see the sandstone parts. These early 2 buildings were, or the early 1 building with 2 sections were constructed of sandstone, which turned red during the fire. And this allows you to see, this is a picture of the interior. You can see the white plaster, this kitchen stove. This was one of the rear rooms of the east side building. And because of this, the heat and the coloration of sandstone, we can actually see where this addition was later placed. So after operating the Stagecoach Inn, Nye ended up expanding it into a store and using limestone this time. So sandstone was used in the original construction, limestone was used a little later, and you can see this in a really clear line here in the structure. So I'm going to annotate again. So here, this line coming down, see, very, very distinct with one stone that they've used to kind of lock it in together. So this store was used building out of these huge hewn limestone blocks from a quarry north of town. And it has a cellar, which is unusual for the time, probably for the storage of goods. And originally it was 2 stories high, though eventually they took a story off. And that's sort of a different tale for a different time. So this is just some of what we found with the Nye stagecoach stop. And this is a fascinating structure. There's a lot of history here. I could do a whole presentation on this just for you. So, you know, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them as well. Let's get rid of the mouse. These are some elevation sketches that me and Hunter Crosby did, just to give you a sense of the type of records we were keeping as we recorded the structures. And again, another photograph of it during the 19th century with an unknown woman here. But you can see it had this large porch. We can still see the stone that you see under the porch archaeologically, some outbuildings, and again, that addition over on the far right-hand side. So we're going to move on to structure 2, also built of sandstone, but using different materials through time. This was known as the Peter Cook House. Some folks grew up knowing it as the Pete de Terra's house. You know, it was a ruin for a lot of folks who can remember it. Though some who remember it, I drove around this area with Melvira at one point, said it was a really beautiful Victorian style house. So it looks a little bit different than these other whitewashed stone houses that we see. This is a picture of it cleared. It was an L-shaped house, but originally it was just one room. You see all the way to the right, and then they added another room, and then they added another room, and you can see this through the different constructions. So it looks a little bit different. Let's get my mouse back here, from here to over here. And then finally what they did is they added this brick addition, and that's what turned the house into an L shape. And these bricks are what we know as Walworth bricks. So someone named Charles Walworth was making bricks, just firing them in his own sort of well-turned kiln, before there was Dehennis Brick and Tile Company, before there was a Seco Brick Company. And so this was an early brick addition to a home. And it again transformed the house into this really nice L-shaped Victorian house, a style that you still see every once in a while. So these bricks here, we can still see the addition. Also made of brick was a large brick patio. And you know, folks like Melvira do remember this. There was a huge patio in that L, tiled in brick all the way across, coming all the way out to a well. And so it would have looked really nice at the time. They would have kept this clear, and you have this beautiful paved patio in this L-shaped building as well. Also interesting, I can't remember if I have a slide for this. No, let's go back one. The well itself was known to be a sulfur well, and this is something I learned from Melvira Carley too. It wasn't used necessarily for drinking water, but it was considered medicinal. So folks would come from around the town and from elsewhere for the medicinal qualities of the sulfur well by the Peter Cook House. And that well is still there. I've not tested it. I didn't smell sulfur, but that's sort of the story, the narrative that we hear around this place. So structures 3, 4, and 5, we recorded together. And we call this the Rudinger Complex. We didn't come up with the Rudinger Complex. I believe the Historic American Building Survey referred to this as the Rudinger Complex back in the 1970s. But this was where the Rudingers lived. And the house in front is a beautiful 2-story stone structure of limestone. You can see that here. The roof has come down much more recently, so we have a lot more of the interior than we do some of these other buildings. Out back of that was a structure built of some sort of sandstone that's a lot softer than what we see elsewhere. And so there's a house that's directly butting up against the back of this 2-story house coming out there, and you can see that in the top left. And then there is a wooden dog trot. So 3 structures here that I sort of consider part of the Rudinger complex. And they were all close together, and from what we've been able to tell from stories, there was Father Rudinger and 2 sons lived in these other houses, and that the father eventually moved to this wooden cabin, which probably has a very deep history of its own, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Let me see what my next slide is. So this is a picture of the Rooting Air Complex as seen in 1972. Doesn't quite look like this anymore, but you can see that the roof is intact. You have this sloping roof here that's very familiar to us. This building directly off the back of the front building, and then you have the dog trot that's out back. So quickly to talk about one of my favorite architectural elements of this building is this really beautiful fireplace. This would have been a really elaborate centerpiece to the house. You can see they photographed it in 1972 here. It has these sort of ornate ornamentations. So you can see kind of rays coming up, carved into the stone. It has a shelf built right in on the side here. And then interestingly, and this is a feature that people report for Alsatian homes, is that the fireplace itself, the chimney curves so that it comes up through the center of the house. So we see this happening in the photograph of the chimney. This is as I saw it and recorded it in 2018. And you can see that the chimney kind of curves up, the flue comes up and over top the window. So the fireplace isn't centered in the home, but the chimney is centered on the exterior of the home, kind of preserving that sense of sort of a symmetrical space. So one more thing before we go into Structure 7, I just want to go back to this dog trot. What's interesting about this dog trot, and again, we didn't get to go inside, it is still standing, it's in great condition, but it looks a lot like the dog trot that was on the Living History Center grounds. This was a really common early architectural style that probably predates the stone houses that we see. So there's a good chance that this wood building is actually one of the oldest standing buildings in D'Hanis. It's easy to kind of forget it or not look at it, but there's oral history that might suggest or sort of pass down folk tales of the town that this might have been, or a building like this would have been what the early church in D'Hanis looked like and what the early schoolhouse in D'Hanis looked like. I can't say for sure that this was that, but it does give us a sense of what these really early buildings looked like. And it's really remarkable that it's been preserved as well as it has. So another interesting kind of tidbit there. So finally, we're gonna get to Structure 7. This is the Zurcher House, based on those early plat maps of D'Hanis, and it is just a beautiful ruin. It is constructed of limestone. It still has many of its wooden lintels and door frames and window frames intact. This, you can see it sits right on the road. It's to the south of the church. And it's similar in a lot of ways to the way the church was constructed. This particular building shows a level of architectural mastery that I don't believe that we see in some of the other buildings. The details are very, very precise and particular. You can see that the stone is laid in a very particular way. Now we see this elsewhere, but the lintels and the windowsills are well placed. The fact that it's standing in the condition that it is, I think, is a testament to the way that it was constructed. This is an interior shot. You can see that some of the wood is still preserved. The walls are still standing. This gap that you see, this is where a fireplace would have been. And you can actually see the mantelpiece, again, really beautifully carved, laying here in the grass. The floor was raised up a foot or so, which may have meant that they were adding dirt floors through time. And the windows, it's difficult to tell, but they actually are beveled. And each window and opening is measured to within a centimeter. They're all very precise and exact and matching measurements. So again, I think a real master builder built this particular structure. I'm gonna play this and hopefully it plays, but this is, again, a shot from the 3D models that we do, which allows you to kind of look at it from different angles and look at it from a bird's eye view as well. And so this gives you a sense of the sort of this photogrammetry process that we use to record. Let's see, as it moves around. So you can see here, actually, there's a room coming off the back of this particular building, but it would have had one central room, and it has that nice symmetry that we see in these old houses with two windows and a door, two doors, in fact, that would have allowed for a cross breeze to happen through the space, and then this side door here. So again, a really beautiful building. I'm still actually looking into a lot of the history here. I know it was a home to different families through time, and that it also has been a ruin for potentially longer than some of these others. But again, it's a testament to its sort of remarkable construction that it's still standing as well as it is. So to move on to the this is a bird's eye view of it from that 3D model. So again, you can see this sort of backwards L shape, small room coming off the back. And this is one of the sketches of it. So again, one of the neat things about this, we don't always see in other ruins, is that a lot of the wood has been preserved. So you can see how people were creating these really kind of typical lintel constructions out of cypress for their homes. And this was probably original, because what we see in here, actually, it's hard to tell, but there's little notches for the wood to fit in the stone itself. So it's been measured out and fit inside to kind of give it that stability. So we can see that those architectural elements in this particular building. So that is what I'd like to share with you today. I know we're getting on long. I'm actually not sure how long I've been talking on this video, but these are some things that I have in progress. I'm working on sharing the 3D models in an online format. So what I'm hoping to do is actually convert them to something that you can take your mouse or your cursor and explore yourself online. And that takes some time in doing, but it's something that I'm excited to do, and I'm able to do with the support of the MCHC. We're working on using GPS points, photos, and sketches to create additional maps of Old Hennis. So I want to make some cleaner maps, also some maybe interactive maps that people can explore and go to the particular houses to see what we've collected in those spaces. And then I collected so many oral histories with y'all. It's really amazing, more than I thought. And so I'm working on finishing those up and getting them into a format where I can deliver them back to everybody and hopefully create some sort of archive where those are permanently available, as well as the story maps that we've worked on in different workshops and that type of thing. So next steps: finish writing my dissertation, finish this work. I have that dissertation completion fellowship, so I will be done in 2021. We're looking at somewhere between May and June, so that will be available. And at that point, I would love to come back and present final findings. You know, I'm finding new things every day. I've learned a lot from just the archival research I've been doing the past couple of months, and I'm always excited to discuss it, because it's only possible because everyone in Medina County welcomed me and allowed me to come in and learn what I have. So that brings me to my thank you slide. There's so many people to thank. Everyone who's watching this now deserves my thanks. Everyone to Hennis, Castroville, and Medina County, my advisor, Ruth Van Dyke, of course, my crew, and then several others that I have listed here. So thank you for listening to my presentation. And I should be on the phone or some sort of voice thing now where I can answer questions for everybody. So I really enjoyed being able to share this with you today, and I hope that you all have a safe and happy holiday next week. Happy Thanksgiving. Okay, bye.